As you examine the trajectory of the Pacific War, the resounding roar of B-25 bombers tearing through Tokyo's midday sky on April 18, 1942, stands as a pivotal turning point that forced Japan onto a fatal defensive footing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor strike, was profoundly disturbed by the intelligence, prompting his chief of staff, Admiral Matt Ugaki, to confide in his journal that the enemy had seized the day's triumph. Although the actual destruction was relatively light, resulting in 50 fatalities, 252 injuries, and 90 ruined structures, this unprecedented foreign assault on Japanese soil in over 600 years completely shattered the illusion of an untouchable homeland and initiated disastrous strategic errors that culminated in the devastating loss at Midway a mere 7 weeks later. The mental shockwave proved so agonizing that the commander tasked with guarding Tokyo's airspace took his own life in ritualistic disgrace, while Yamamoto's operations executive, Captain Kuroshima, described the sudden incursion as a tremor running down the spine of the entire country. You can see the sheer audacity of the operation when considering that the squadron of 16 heavily customized B-25 Mitchell aircraft, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and armed with 4 500-pound explosives each, took flight from the United States ship USS Hornet, 650 nautical miles away from the coast. Because the strike force was detected prematurely at 7:38 in the morning by the Japanese patrol vessel Nito Maru, they were forced to launch 250 miles earlier than anticipated. Yet this forced improvisation brilliantly highlighted American ingenuity, exposed glaring defensive weaknesses, and set the stage for Japan's catastrophic naval defeat at Midway. Prior to the conflict, the prevailing dogma within the Imperial Japanese Navy confidently dismissed the threat of carrier-launched bomber attacks, grounding their absolute certainty in what they believed to be sound technical evaluations. Naval planners had calculated that carrier-based airplanes were strictly confined to a combat radius of 200 to 250 nautical miles, as the machines inherently required sufficient fuel to navigate back to the ship, a premise that entirely dictated the placement of their defensive perimeter. The very concept of utilizing medium bombers from floating runways contradicted everything they understood about naval aviation physics, primarily because the massive 67-foot wingspan of the B-25 Mitchell completely overshadowed the dimensions of conventional maritime planes, like the 27-foot F-4F Wildcat or the 42-foot SBD Dauntless. Carrying a fully loaded weight of approximately 27,000 to 29,000 pounds for the raid, the B-25 was nearly 3 times heavier than any typical carrier aircraft of the era. Japanese doctrine logically assessed that such massive machines could never achieve carrier launches, as standard takeoff requirements demanded over 800 feet of runway, a distance far longer than any existing flight deck. But this perfectly rational assumption proved fatally flawed. Through extensive engineering overhauls at Eglin Field, Florida, American technicians completely transformed the bombers for this exact mission by installing 265-gallon steel reservoirs in the bomb bays, integrating flexible rubber bladder tanks, and stowing 10 5-gallon jerry cans per aircraft for manual refueling during the flight. To offset the reality that they had nearly doubled their fuel capacity from 670 to 1,189 gallons, the maintenance crews drastically reduced weight by removing the bottom turret, heavy radio equipment, and unnecessary materials, even substituting fake wooden guns in the tail to deter pursuing fighters. You must appreciate the sheer mechanical wizardry of Lieutenant Henry Miller, who developed revolutionary short-field takeoff techniques that seemed to outright defy physics. Aviators were instructed to hold both feet on the brakes with half flaps engaged and the stabilizer pulled back 3/4, deliberately building maximum manifold pressure before their sudden release. Utilizing this aggressive tactic, Doolittle's Vanguard ship roared into the sky, utilizing a mere 467 feet of deck space, while Lieutenant Donald Smith miraculously achieved flight in an unbelievable 287 feet, all thanks to a 20-knot headwind merging with the carrier's forward speed to provide crucial additional lift. Meanwhile, Japan's defensive calculations had anchored their early warning line of converted fishing trawlers and prescribed intervals based on observed patterns from previous United States carrier raids on Wake and Marcus Islands, where American forces had approached within 200 miles. Because they possessed no radar systems in April 1942, the Empire depended utterly on visual detection from these picket boats. This critical vulnerability meant that the No. 23 Nito Mararu, which spotted Task Force 16, was positioned 650 miles from Japan, well beyond their expected threat perimeter, and far too late to prevent the strike. As you envision the atmosphere in Tokyo that morning, the day had commenced with a routine air raid drill where no sirens sounded, leaving local wardens to gaze up into placid skies while firefighting brigades lazily trundled their equipment through the streets in a mechanical rehearsal. Once the drill ended at noon without fanfare, millions of urban residents went shopping, visited parks and shrines, and attended baseball games, entirely oblivious to the impending danger overhead. An expatriate French reporter stationed in the city perfectly captured the sudden rupture of peace, recording how he heard the rugged, powerful roar of airplane engines at high noon, followed by violent explosions. Noting a dark, extremely fast aircraft skimming the rooftops, the journalist came to the chilling realization that the enemy had finally arrived. Initially, the Japanese civilians didn't comprehend the terrifying reality they were witnessing, pausing to cheerfully wave at the fast-moving, twin-engine aircraft before finally noticing the brilliant white stars that marked them as American. The horrific realization struck different witnesses at different moments. Some, as they watched the heavy bombs detach and fall, and others, only when the frantic anti-aircraft fire erupted into the sky. The psychological devastation inflicted upon the public vastly outstripped the physical damage, largely because Radio Tokyo had repeatedly assured citizens that they, their nation, and Emperor Hirohito remained completely safe from enemy attack. The populace believed they were shielded by the kamikaze mystique, an impenetrable spiritual fortress that had not been seriously threatened since the invasion attempt by Kublai Khan in 1281. Tasked with protecting this sacred airspace was the 26th Air Flotilla under Rear Admiral Sego Yamagata, which relied heavily upon the Kisarazu Air Group stationed at Kisarazu Airfield in Chiba Prefecture to form the first line of aerial defense. In a desperate scramble, the flotilla dispatched 29 Mitsubishi G4M Betty medium bombers equipped with torpedoes, alongside 24 carrier fighters carrying long-range tanks, all hunting for American carriers they assumed must be operating within 200 miles of the homeland. As the defending Japanese fighter pilots finally encountered the roaring B-25s, they found themselves confronting an absolutely unprecedented tactical situation that shattered their deeply held military doctrines. As you examine this operation, you will notice that the American aircraft skimmed the crests of the waves, descending far closer to the ocean surface than anyone expected, before ascending to a mere 1,500 feet to execute their bombing sequences. Above the city of Yokohama, a handful of the newly developed liquid-cooled Kai-61 interceptors entered the fray, marking their combat debut in vessels so unfamiliar that United States aviators erroneously identified them as German Bf-109s. Astonishingly, you will find that the Imperial aviators demonstrated a distinct lack of aggression upon intersecting the invading squadron. Numerous defenders either hesitated to press their tactical advantage to the fullest or entirely misidentified the distinct outlines of the B-25s as their own domestic planes. Consequently, the defensive response proved utterly ineffective. Although Imperial broadcasts boasted of eliminating 9 hostile craft, the reality was that they failed to destroy even one. Furthermore, as the naval commander, Shigeyoshi Miwa, observed with deep resentment, the ground-based artillery units performed equally poorly. While the gunners accurately calculated the elevation, their fierce but imprecise volleys routinely detonated wide of their fast-moving targets, ultimately inflicting only superficial shrapnel damage upon the B-25, piloted by First Lieutenant Richard Joyce. You can see how the sudden bombardment provoked a mixture of profound emotional turmoil and visionary tactical insight from Admiral Yamamoto. Merely a few days prior to the incursion, he had penned a correspondence to Niwa Michichi at her Tokyo geisha residence, expressing mild concern over the public's premature complacency. He noted that, after slightly more than 3 months of conflict, the populace was already expressing gratitude toward him for the complete absence of aerial assaults. With remarkable foresight, the commander cautioned that this temporary reprieve was entirely attributable to the adversary's decisions, rather than his own protective measures. Once the strike actually materialized, Yamamoto openly shared his sorrow over Tokyo finally suffering an attack. Yet he maintained a practical perspective. He suggested the harrowing experience would serve as a necessary, sobering taste of reality to shatter the citizens' unwarranted optimism. Furthermore, he offered a scathing critique of his own military's incompetence, lamenting it as an absolute disgrace that hostile forces managed to defile the heavens above the imperial capital without suffering a single casualty. You must understand that this audacious aerial assault provided Yamamoto with the exact political leverage required to shatter the administrative roadblocks hindering his proposed Midway offensive. Prior to the bombing, the Naval High Command, guided by Admiral Osami Nagano, heavily favored a strategy of isolating Australia through the systematic occupation of Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. These officials had stubbornly waved away Yamamoto's warnings regarding aircraft carriers striking the Japanese homeland as unreasonable fantasies, only to be harshly corrected by the sudden appearance of American munitions. The subsequent shift in military momentum was incredibly swift. Reeling from the deep embarrassment inflicted upon the imperial leadership, officials hastily concluded their deliberations and officially sanctioned the Midway assault on May 5th, disseminating Navy Order No. 18 to direct the occupation of both Midway and critical Aleutian positions. Consequently, the Empire's primary goals for this upcoming campaign were entirely shaped by the vital need to halt subsequent raids, push their defensive boundaries further east, eliminate the surviving aircraft carriers of the United States Pacific Fleet, and secure Midway as a forward stronghold. Ironically, the simultaneous Aleutian diversionary operation, intended to neutralize potential bombing threats from Alaska, diverted 2 vital carriers away from the main engagement, severely weakening Yamamoto's primary armada precisely at the critical battle. When you review the surviving records detailing the responses of high-ranking imperial officers, they expose an institution desperately struggling to process a scenario they previously deemed impossible. Writing in his wartime diary with uncharacteristic directness, Admiral Mate Ugaki, who served as Yamamoto's chief of staff, lamented the fading glory of their forces, conceding that the adversary had claimed the triumph of the day. Meanwhile, Captain Kuroshima Kamio, the Admiral's exceptionally brilliant yet unconventional operations director, elegantly characterized the sudden attack as a tremor shuddering through Japan. This poetic phrase perfectly captured both the brief physical presence of the bombers and their enduring psychological effect. Even amid their bitter disappointment, naval leaders such as Mitsuo Fuida and Shigeyoshi Miwa maintained their professional objectivity, freely acknowledging that the operation represented excellent strategy from the American perspective. Concurrently, you'll notice a stark gap opening between the government's public narratives and the empirical reality. Whereas state-sponsored propaganda immediately claimed the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians, classified internal military documents unearthed post-war revealed a significantly lower actual toll, documenting exactly 50 killed, 252 injured, and 90 buildings either damaged or destroyed. you will find that the military's false claim regarding the destruction of 9 American aircraft particularly galled officers like Midway, who were painfully aware that the defensive network had failed to destroy even one. Before any official announcement emerged from the United States, Radio Tokyo transmitted the initial broadcast, declaring that enemy bombers had appeared over Tokyo for the first time in the current war. The broadcast falsely insisted, however, that these invading planes failed to cause any damage to military establishments. Swiftly pivoting its strategy, the propaganda machine resorted to wordplay, dubbing the historic mission the Do-Nothing Raid. Operating through formal channels, Emperor Hirohito nonetheless exerted profound and significant involvement in the aftermath of the event. He personally commuted the death sentences handed down to 3 of the 8 captured raiders, actively participated in strategic decisions regarding retaliation, and ordered his army in China to totally destroy military installations, airfields, and important lines of communication throughout the areas where the aviators had landed. As you trace the conception of this daring operation, it leads back to a critical observation made by Navy Captain Francis Lowe at Naval Station Norfolk on January 10, 1942. Watching Army bombers practice over a runway painted with carrier deck outlines, Lowe realized that twin-engine bombers might actually launch from genuine carriers. Admiral Ernest King enthusiastically embraced the concept, prompting General Hap Arnold to select Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a test pilot, an aeronautical engineer with a PhD from MIT, and a master of the calculated risk, to lead the mission. Doolittle's selection process at Eglin Field in Florida began with the 17th Bombardment Group, which possessed the most experienced B-25 crews available. When asked for volunteers for a dangerous, secret mission, all 140 men stepped forward without hesitation. From these candidates, Doolittle selected 24 5-man crews, eventually reducing the roster to 16 for the actual mission. Ultimately, the grueling training regimen, spanning from February 27th to March 25th, 1942, pushed both the men and their machines to their absolute limits. When you examine the intense preparations for this mission, you will discover that aviators meticulously rehearsed abbreviated takeoffs using silhouettes of flight decks painted directly onto their runways, eventually managing reliable ascents in under 400 feet, skimming perilously close to the ground, navigating across vast expanses of ocean, and executing precision drops from minimal elevations soon felt entirely routine to the crews. As I review the historical blueprints, it is clear that extensive mechanical alterations converted every B-25 bomber into a dedicated, long-distance attack vessel by doubling its gasoline reserves and systematically stripping away all non-essential gear to minimize the overall payload. I want you to understand that every aircraft was manned by a dedicated team of 5 experts, comprising a commander, a second-in-command, a pathfinder, a munitions specialist, and a mechanic gunner. This extraordinary roster featured standout figures such as Ted Lawson, who later penned a widely read autobiographical account of the daring mission. Also aboard were Robert Gray, who was tragically destined to perish in the China-Burma-India operational zone during October 1942, and James Doolittle's right-hand man Richard Cole, who ultimately outlived all his fellow participants, before passing away in April 2019 at the remarkable age of 103. The departure protocol executed on April 18th showcased the absolute pinnacle of United States naval and aerial synergy, even as violent ocean swells repeatedly washed over the USS Hornet's forward deck. Because enemy patrols had spotted the task force, the commanders had to initiate the launch 10 hours ahead of schedule and 170 nautical miles further away from the Japanese coastline than originally intended. Nevertheless, you can see the sheer skill involved as all 16 warplanes achieved a flawless liftoff between 8:20 and 9:19 a.m., with Doolittle setting the example by departing first, utilizing a mere 467 feet of available runway. As I delve into the grim aftermath, I must tell you that 2 entire B-25 contingents were ultimately captured by Imperial forces, plunging them into a harrowing nightmare that laid bare the sheer cruelty of their captors. The aircraft, designated as the Green Hornet, commanded by Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, tragically plunged into the sea near the Chinese shoreline when its fuel tanks ran dry, claiming the lives of 2 men who drowned in the wreckage. Meanwhile, the men aboard Bat Out of Hell, led by Lieutenant William Farrow, were forced to parachute directly into hostile, occupied territory in the vicinity of Nanchang. The 8 surviving prisoners, Dean Hallmark, Robert Mader, and Chase Nielsen from the 6th group, alongside William Farrow, Robert Height, George Barr, Harold Spatz, and Jacob DeShazer from the 16th, were hastily transported to Tokyo to face severe questioning by the Kempeitai military police. Officially recorded atrocities inflicted upon them featured the horrific water cure, where interrogators compelled the captives to ingest up to 5 gallons of fluid laced with kerosene and bodily waste. The guards would force this noxious mixture down their throats until the prisoners' stomachs became monstrously distended, before violently stomping or leaping upon their bloated torsos. In a calculated move to establish a false legal justification for putting the aviators to death, the imperial leadership enacted the Enemy Airmen's Act on August 13, 1942. Implemented retroactively, this legislation accused the captives of intentionally attacking non-combatants from the air, even though I can assure you absolutely no proof existed to validate such fabricated claims. Consequently, a sham tribunal held at the Shanghai Constabulary headquarters on August 28th stripped the men of any right to legal representation, ultimately condemning all 8 defendants to the ultimate penalty. Although Emperor Hirohito ultimately reduced 5 of those fatal decrees to permanent incarceration, 3 unfortunate soldiers still had to face the firing squad. At exactly 4:30 p.m. on October 15, 1942, 28-year-old Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, 24-year-old Lieutenant William Farrow, and 21-year-old Sergeant Harold Spatz were transported to Public Cemetery No. 1, beyond the limits of Shanghai, and shot to death. Tragically, Lieutenant Robert Mader also perished on December 1, 1943, succumbing to severe starvation, dysentery, and beriberi, following 20 agonizing months as a prisoner of war. The remaining 4 captives, Chase Nielsen, Robert Height, George Barr, and Jacob DeShazer, suffered through 40 grueling months behind bars, which included 34 agonizing months of total isolation. Their relentless ordeal finally concluded when United States airborne troops rescued them on August 20, 1945. Meanwhile, the vengeful fury unleashed by the Japanese military upon the Chinese populace for assisting the downed American flyers stands as one of the most horrifying massacres you will ever encounter in the history of the Pacific conflict. Initiated on May 15, 1942, a mere 27 days following the American strike, Operation Sago, also known as the Zhejiang-Zhangji campaign, raged relentlessly until September 4th, laying waste to roughly 20,000 square miles of the Chinese landscape. General Shunroku Hata commanded the massive China Expeditionary Army, mobilizing overwhelming troop concentrations for this brutal and unforgiving sweep across the mainland. This massive offensive force integrated the 13th Army under Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada and the 11th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Isamu Yokoyama, combining 40 infantry battalions and 15 to 16 artillery battalions for a staggering total strength of roughly 180,000 soldiers. I find it profoundly disturbing to share with you that General Shiro Ishii dispatched 150 operatives from the infamous Unit 731, arming them with devastating biological pathogens such as cholera, typhoid, bubonic plague, dysentery, anthrax, and paratyphoid. The resulting toll on human life was utterly staggering to contemplate, as Imperial troops slaughtered 250,000 Chinese non-combatants simply for offering refuge to the escaping American aviators. The defending Chinese military forces suffered immense losses as well, recording 724 commanding officers and 23,637 enlisted men killed in action, alongside thousands more who were maimed or vanished entirely. Ironically, this germ warfare strategy resulted in a disastrous self-inflicted blow, as over 10,000 Japanese combatants inadvertently contracted their own manufactured diseases. This catastrophic miscalculation led directly to the deaths of 1,700 Imperial soldiers, who succumbed primarily to rampant cholera outbreaks. This methodical annihilation was explicitly designed to eradicate any chance that regional bases might launch subsequent bombing runs against the Japanese homeland. To achieve this, Imperial squadrons conducted an astonishing 1,131 distinct aerial bombardments, concentrated solely on the Kuzhou airstrip, which had been Doolittle's primary target destination. By the end of the campaign, I can confirm that every single runway possessing the dimensions required to accommodate B-25 aircraft had been completely and permanently destroyed. The profound strategic shockwaves generated by the American strike decisively shifted the entire momentum of the Pacific conflict, setting off a chain reaction that heavily factored into the ultimate downfall of the Japanese Empire. Its most pressing consequence compelled the Imperial command to pull 4 vital Army fighter squadrons back to guard their domestic airspace between 1942 and 1943. Initiating a disastrous pattern of mismanaged resources exactly when those planes were critically required in the Southern Theater. Furthermore, this psychological blow effectively fast-tracked the crucial clash at Midway, neutralizing resistance within the naval command hierarchy and locking in ground force support for Admiral Yamamoto's ambitious offensive agenda. Ultimately, as I analyze these events, you can see how this bold incursion steered the Imperial fleet directly toward its initial, catastrophic maritime loss. By rerouting a pair of aircraft carriers toward the Aleutian Islands to proactively neutralize potential bomber staging grounds, the Japanese High Command critically diluted their primary Midway armada right when maximum strength was essential. When 4 of their premier fleet carriers plunged to the ocean floor between June 4th and 5th, 1942, the Empire was stripped not merely of vital vessels, but of veteran aviators and their overarching tactical advantage. Simultaneously, the operation engineered a profound psychological shift, instilling a deep-seated fear complex within the Japanese leadership that resulted in bloated, impractical defensive deployments until the conflict's conclusion. Forced into a reactive posture, they overextended their territorial boundaries far beyond what they could successfully maintain. This fatal strategic pivot ultimately left their vast logistical networks thoroughly exposed and highly vulnerable to relentless devastation by United States submarine interdiction. When you examine the enduring influence on Japan's martial strategy, you will see it revealed itself across multiple dimensions, fundamentally altering their wartime posture. By elevating the protection of their domestic islands to a supreme priority, Imperial commanders siphoned vital assets away from active battlefronts, a decision that ultimately hastened their downfalls across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Furthermore, you can observe how the psychological shockwave generated by the assault directly contributed to the disastrous loss of forward momentum following the clash at Midway, granting America the critical opportunity to capture and relentlessly sustain the upper hand throughout its subsequent island-hopping operations. Scholars of armed conflict continue to present you with debates over whether the pivotal engagement at Midway would have materialized in the absence of the Doolittle Raid. In their analytical work, Shattered Sword, authors Jonathan Perel and Anthony Tully suggest to you that even though this audacious strike served as a primary trigger, the foundational blueprints for the Midway offensive had been drafted well before the 18th of April. Nevertheless, these historians concede that the sudden attack proved instrumental in shattering the domestic opposition within Japan's high command, thereby drastically speeding up their operational schedule. Expanding on this consequence, Mark Stiller highlights for you how the incursion forced the imperial leadership to adopt an incredibly wasteful distribution of military assets, a defensive crippling that plagued their forces until the conflict's conclusion. Looking at the aviators who fell into enemy hands, you will find the ordeal of Jacob Disa emerging as a profound testament to both immense psychological endurance and radical personal metamorphosis. Serving as the bombardier for crew number 16, he suffered through 40 agonizing months as a prisoner of the Japanese, surviving brutal physical abuse, severe malnutrition, and a staggering 34 months entirely in isolation. Amidst this bleak incarceration, gaining access to a Bible for merely 3 weeks during 1944 managed to fundamentally rewire his entire worldview. Ultimately, you see Disa walking away from his grueling confinement harboring a breathtaking resolution. He would travel back to the very nation that had tortured him, this time serving as an emissary of faith. By the time 1948 arrived, a mere 3 years following his emancipation, he stepped foot in Nagoya, a metropolis he had previously targeted with explosives, to embark upon 30 years of dedicated spiritual outreach. A written testimony he authored, titled, "I Was a Prisoner of Japan," was distributed massively across the island nation, successfully delivering a powerful theme of absolute pardon to millions of readers. You will find that this publication achieved its most astonishing spiritual shift when it was consumed by Mitsuo Fuida, the very commander who had orchestrated the aerial assault on Pearl Harbor. Grappling with the devastation of his country's surrender and desperately hunting for purpose, Fuida experienced a profound spiritual awakening through Diasa's written words, leading these two former adversaries to evolve into close companions and collaborative preachers, standing before you as the ultimate embodiment of post-war harmony. If you trace the post-war journeys of the other airmen who endured alongside Disa, you'll notice they navigated vastly divergent paths as they attempted to rebuild their lives. Chase Nielsen chose to maintain his martial commitment, eventually concluding his professional tenure as a highly respected career officer within the Air Force. Meanwhile, Robert Hite transitioned into the civilian workforce, though he simultaneously maintained his dedication to the Air Force Reserve until his passing in 2015, marking the departure of the operation's final surviving participant. Tragically, as you look at the fate of George Barr, you see a man who sustained irreversible harm from the vicious abuses he endured. He received a medical discharge and wrestled constantly with severe mental anguish until his life ended in 1967. You can clearly see that the Doolittle Raid secured a level of tactical and psychological triumph that vastly eclipsed anything its original architects had dared to imagine. Even though the actual infrastructural destruction was relatively negligible, the strike completely obliterated the unshakable confidence of the Japanese populace, hastened catastrophic command errors at Midway, provoked a horrific campaign of vengeance across China, and compelled the empire into a wasteful distribution of defensive resources for the duration of the hostilities. However, you must also recognize that this daring enterprise exacted a devastating toll upon the 80 men who voluntarily flew the mission. The casualties were grim. 3 perished directly during the initial assault or subsequent evasion. 3 faced execution by their captors. 1 succumbed while imprisoned, and another 10 lost their lives in later military campaigns. Yet their collective sacrifice permanently redirected the overarching course of the global conflict. From an engineering standpoint, you must recognize that successfully propelling medium-weight Army bombers off the deck of a naval vessel showcased a brilliant fusion of American ingenuity and cross-branch collaboration, setting a cooperative standard that defined the Pacific theater. Executing flawless takeoffs with the B-25 aircraft completely shattered Imperial beliefs regarding aerial limitations, fueling a lethal habit among the enemy of chronically undervaluing United States military potential. The High Command in Tokyo instantly grasped the monumental gravity of the breach. Admiral Yamamoto's profound anguish, coupled with the self-inflicted death of the capital's air defense chief and widespread admissions of systemic failure, exposed an establishment waking up to a terrifying new reality. In those fleeting moments above the capital, the deeply ingrained legend of an impenetrable homeland, a sacred belief nurtured ever since a divine tempest repelled the Mongol fleet in 1281, was irrevocably destroyed right before their eyes. Back in the United States, you can understand how this daring incursion supplied the critical, urgent reassurance that the Imperial Island fortress was not immune to direct retaliation. Following a grueling season of continuous retreats and devastating losses throughout the Pacific, the sudden visualization of American aircraft dominating the skies above Tokyo served to massively reinvigorate the spirit of a weary populace. This operation firmly justified the deliberate gambles that would come to serve as the bedrock of the military's strategic playbook across the ocean. Furthermore, the sheer human element, 80 aviators embracing almost certain doom, ordinary Chinese citizens laying their lives on the line to shelter downed pilots, and Tokyo residents finally enduring the brutal reality of a conflict they had cheered just months prior, elevates this history for you into a profound human epic. The deeply personal narratives, from Ted Lawson sacrificing a limb and penning his iconic recollections, to Jacob Deeser preaching forgiveness in the ruins he helped create, and Richard Cole surviving to the remarkable age of 103 as the final witness, inject profound soul into cold, strategic calculations. Ultimately, you will find the Doolittle Raid functions as a flawless exhibition of psychological combat, securing through sheer fearlessness what standard troop deployments simply could not manage. By shattering the enemy's rigid beliefs concerning naval aviation limits, laying bare the absolute vulnerability of their capital, and forcing a massive strategic overextension, 16 B-25 bombers managed to pivot the trajectory of the Pacific conflict far more aggressively than massive naval armadas ever could. The authentic triumph of this mission was never measured by the payload detonated on the ground, but rather by the sheer panic implanted in the minds of the enemy leadership. Admiral Yamamoto's prescient caution that the lack of American aggression was not a testament to Japanese invincibility was chillingly validated, as the naval brass rapidly shifted from arrogantly ignoring warnings of carrier strikes to demonstrating utter hysteria. Consequently, you can trace every ensuing blunder in their martial planning directly back to those few decisive minutes flying above the heart of the empire. As modern defense scholars will tell you, the Doolittle Raid serves as a premier illustration of asymmetric combat, where immense operational consequences are harvested purely through weaponized psychology. A relatively modest expenditure, consisting of 80 aviators, 16 customized aircraft, and a pair of naval vessels, generated dividends that permanently sculpted the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Nevertheless, you must critically acknowledge the harrowing mortal toll exacted by this historic undertaking. The subsequent slaughter of Chinese civilians, executed as a direct act of vengeance, ranks among the most drastically imbalanced acts of retribution ever recorded in human history. Furthermore, the savage torment and extrajudicial killing of the imprisoned airmen completely obliterated any accepted conventions of wartime engagement, ensuring that these atrocities remain an enduring reminder to you of the grisly horrors that so often underpin celebrated military triumphs. Observing former antagonists transform into emissaries of peace, with veterans returning to the Japanese nation, and figures like Mitsuo Fuchida embracing the Christian faith, inspires a profound optimism that the most devastating horrors of combat can ultimately give way to true reconciliation. This collective narrative proposes that while the Doolittle Raid decisively altered the military trajectory of the Pacific theater, its most significant lasting impact might be showcasing the extraordinary human capacity for forgiveness following the darkest depths of wartime brutality. When those 16 B-25 aircraft lifted off from the flight deck of the USS Hornet on the overcast morning of April 18, 1942, they transported a payload far greater than mere munitions. They served as undeniable proof that radical innovation has the power to conquer the impossible, that sheer boldness can completely shatter guaranteed outcomes, and that a small group of 80 volunteers managed to rewrite history throughout their brief journey across the skies of Tokyo.